Fund accounting is a system that's used in accounting that's used to track the amount of cash that you have assigned for different purposes and the usage of that cash. Well, I want to unpack the truth about this idea of fund accounting. First of all, moving cash for combined transactions is tedious and it results in incredible amount of errors. I've seen it. So for example, you receive one donation check and that check has funds that are for a building or capital campaign and funds for operations or not restricted funds. So you record the check and then you have to go do the manual moving cash around, right? So you record it, you can't split a check. So you got to put it all in one bank account. And then what do? You come back and try to figure out how much was for that other purpose and then move that to a different bank account. Well, what happens when the check NSFs? You've got to rewind all those transactions. Highly tedious. It happens on the expense side too, right? So you're writing a check to pay an employee. That employee is paid from 3 different funding sources, splits their time through 3 different fundings methods or the methods that were funded. Okay, so what do? Move cash again? Wow, you would spend all your time moving cash around to accomplish a very important goal of knowing what the purposes were for funds. They were used according to those purposes. Okay, second thing I want to say is that fund accounting is not required by generally accepted accounting principles, which are the accounting standards that apply to most nonprofits. It is required, fund accounting is required for governmental entities. So if you're a governmental entity, not talking to you, talking to nonprofits. So let's talk third about what matters. What matters is that funds that are received are tracked by their purpose and that the fulfillment of that purpose is maintained for accountability purposes. Okay, so there's a better way. Let me introduce you today. Nonprofits are required to report on the balances of funds with restrictions and funds without restrictions. So how can you do this more efficiently? Well, that will definitely depend on your accounting system. I want to give you 2 examples. Blackbaud Financial Edge allows you to accomplish this using what they call project codes. They also have a system that you can use that allows you to actually create funds, but not track the cash separately, rather to commingle the cash and use an inner fund, a due to, due from, to track the balance at any given time. Okay, also QuickBooks. I want to tell you a little bit about QuickBooks method. It's using classes. The classes are able to be used, and it's QuickBooks recommendation. I've bumped into this recently as well with a client that I've worked with, is that only income and expense get a class coding. Don't code the asset, don't code the liability, just the income and the expense. So what does that look like? Well, when you're making a deposit in QuickBooks accounting records, if you have a deposit for $100 and 50 of it went to one purpose and 50 went to the other, you can create 2 lines on your deposit, and over towards the right, there's a place where you would check the class. If it's not there, it means your company configuration is not yet set up, and you'll want to look for a help tip out. Lots of QuickBooks bloggers and YouTubers out there, you'll quickly find a tip on how to turn on the class feature in your company settings. Okay, so same thing will work when you're on the expense side. You're writing a check, the check has a split, you create separate line items for those appropriate classes is what QuickBooks call them. But really what they are is they are what generally accepted accounting principle calls assets, net assets with restrictions or without restrictions. So how will you know your balances? A couple of steps here. First one is you're going to run an income statement of activities. Those are the same, refer to the same report called by 2 different names depending on the program you're using. You're going to run it by class, and it's going to have columns for each of those restrictions that we're talking about, or classes is what QuickBooks calls them, and they're going to show the ins, income, the outs, expenses by class, so that you can review that report at any given time and make sure that the ins and outs of those agree to what transaction should have been coded. I want to mention here that anything without a restriction is going to show up in a column that's called not specified, and I wish we could change that, but just going to have to mentally get used to in QuickBooks. Not specified means no restriction, without a restriction. And then the complementary report you're going to need to run is what I would call a custom net asset report, or it's a it's a custom balance sheet. I would call it a net asset report. And it's going to be a report that's going to track the balances for those restrictions. So it takes anything that happened in the prior year, brings it in as a balance, and then the net activity we just talked about, the ins and outs of the year, will be subtotaled to a net number and appear below it, so that you get the final current balance of restrictions. And so these cash balances, your cash balances can be reviewed then in light of this net asset report. I kind of think about it like if you're a nonprofit and you've got lots of things coming into maybe like one pot of soup, right? So as it all comes into the soup, you don't have to track your carrots separate from your onions from your meat. You can put it all in the same pot, but the net asset report is like the size of the spoon that's obligated to each of the program or the purposes, restrictions that you've agreed to accept funds for. So you have an obligation to spend that out the way that you agreed when you took it in. Okay, if this sounds like it's all too much and you'd like a guide in the process, I'm happy to help. Just jump on my website, schedule a strategic consult with me today. There's a link here where you're watching. It can also be found right on my homepage. I'll make it easy for you, but I'd love to help you create a strategy for implementing this in your organization.